06:45, October 25, 1944. Philippine Sea, off the coast of Samar Island. Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on what remained of USS Johnston's bridge, blood soaking through the remains of his torn uniform shirt, 2 fingers of his left hand severed by shrapnel, and made a decision that violated every assumption about how destroyers were supposed to behave when confronted by battleships. He ordered his crippled ship to turn directly toward the largest warship ever constructed. From his vantage point, Evans could see Yamato's pagoda mast rising through the morning haze, her 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells that weighed more than Johnston's entire forward gun mount. His destroyer had already absorbed 3 direct hits from those massive weapons. Half his engineering plant was destroyed. 3 of his 5 guns were inoperable. His ship could barely make 17 knots. The rational decision was to withdraw, to preserve what remained of his vessel and crew. Instead, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Evans pointed Johnston toward the heart of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force and prepared to engage targets that outweighed his destroyer by a factor of 50 to 1. This was not heroism born from strength. This was desperation weaponized into tactical doctrine, and in the next 90 minutes, this counterintuitive approach, repeated by multiple American destroyer captains who should have known better, would save 6 escort carriers from certain destruction and fundamentally alter how naval officers understood the relationship between firepower and resolve. The story of why destroyer captains began charging battleships head-on at Samar doesn't begin with courage. It begins with catastrophic failure in command and control, a series of assumptions that proved disastrously wrong, and the recognition that conventional defensive tactics against overwhelming force guaranteed annihilation. To understand why Evans and his fellow commanders adopted suicidal tactics that somehow succeeded, you must first understand what American destroyers were supposed to do when faced with battleships, and why those doctrines collapsed completely on the morning of October 25. In October 1944, American naval doctrine regarding destroyer employment against superior surface forces emphasized preservation of assets through evasion and defensive smoke screens. Destroyers existed primarily to screen fleet carriers, conduct anti-submarine patrols, and attack enemy capital ships only when conditions strongly favored success. The Fletcher-class destroyers that comprised Taffy 3's screen, USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Heermann, displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded and carried 5 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets. Their primary anti-ship weapons were 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, carrying Mark 15 torpedoes with 825-pound warheads. These were formidable weapons against cruisers or other destroyers. Against battleships, with armor belts measuring 16 inches of hardened steel, they represented pinpricks. Standard doctrine specified that destroyers facing superior surface forces should lay smoke screens to conceal larger friendly units, then withdraw to preserve combat effectiveness for future operations. Trading destroyers for battleships was considered poor tactical economy. A destroyer cost roughly $8 million and required 18 months to construct. Losing one to damage a battleship that might survive the engagement represented an unfavorable exchange. This calculus made perfect sense when fleet carriers and battleships operated together, providing mutual support. Destroyers could screen the carriers while battleships engaged enemy capital ships. The destroyers preserved themselves for anti-submarine warfare and screening duties, while the big guns handled surface combat. But on the morning of October 25, 1944, this entire framework collapsed because the battleships that were supposed to be protecting Taffy 3's northern flank did not exist where Admiral Clifton Sprague believed they were stationed. The failure began 3 days earlier when Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet, made a series of decisions that would leave Leyte Gulf's northern approaches completely unguarded. On October 24th, Halsey's carrier aircraft had attacked Vice Admiral Kurita's center force as it transited the Philippine Sea. Wave after wave of American dive bombers and torpedo planes struck the Japanese formation throughout the afternoon. The super battleship Musashi, became the focus of concentrated attack, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed any other warship afloat. American pilots reported hitting Musashi with 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb hits, though Japanese sources recorded 11 torpedoes and 10 bombs. The exact count remained disputed, but the result was indisputable. At 19:35 on October 24th, Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. More significantly, Kurita temporarily reversed course westward around 1500 hours, appearing to retreat from the battle. Admiral Halsey, reading pilot reports describing Kurita's force as heavily damaged and retiring, concluded the center force had been neutralized as an effective threat. That same evening, Halsey received reports of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force approaching from the north. The bait that Japanese planners had prepared proved irresistible. Carriers represented the decisive weapon of Pacific naval warfare, the instruments that had won at Coral Sea and Midway, that had devastated Japanese bases from Rabaul to Truk. Halsey took his entire Third Fleet, all 6 fast battleships, 8 fleet carriers, and their escorts, and raced northward at maximum speed to destroy Ozawa's carriers. He left no ships to guard San Bernardino Strait. More critically, he failed to clearly communicate this decision to Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commander of 7th Fleet, responsible for protecting the Leyte invasion force. Halsey had transmitted a preparatory dispatch about forming Task Force 34, a powerful battleship group under Admiral Willis Lee, to guard the strait. But this was merely a contingency plan, not an executed order. Through a series of miscommunications and assumptions, Kincaid believed Task Force 34 had been detached and was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor read the same dispatches and made identical assumptions. No such force existed. The strait lay completely unguarded. Kurita, having reorganized his battered force after Musashi's loss, reversed course again after nightfall and steamed eastward through San Bernardino Strait. At 0035 on October 25th, his force passed through unopposed. Not a single American ship or aircraft observed the transit. 4 battleships, led by Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers now headed south along Samar's eastern coast toward completely undefended American landing beaches. Between Kurita's overwhelming firepower and General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 vulnerable troops ashore stood only 3 small task units of escort carriers designated by call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. These were never designed for surface combat against battleships. Built on merchant ship hulls at Kaiser shipyards, they were slow, lightly armed, and unarmored, with maximum speeds of 18 knots. Their purpose was providing close air support for troops ashore and conducting anti-submarine patrols. Taffy 3, the northernmost unit positioned closest to San Bernardino Strait, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, known as Ziggy, to distinguish him from another Admiral Sprague commanding Taffy 1. Ziggy Sprague's force consisted of 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers and 7 screening warships, the 3 Fletcher-class destroyers and 4 John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts collectively called the Small Boys. At 0637 on October 25th, Ensign William Brooks, flying routine anti-submarine patrol in his Grumman TBF Avenger, spotted pagoda masts rising from the horizon and radioed words that would trigger the most improbable surface action in naval history. "Those are not our ships." Admiral Sprague received the report with disbelief bordering on irritation. "Some screwy young aviator reporting our own forces," he muttered to his staff. The identification had to be mistaken. Those ships must be Admiral Halsey's battleships from Task Force 34. Everyone knew Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Sprague ordered Brooks to verify his identification. 3 minutes later, Brooks confirmed with words that froze Sprague's blood. "I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." At 0645, Lookouts on the escort carriers spotted anti-aircraft bursts on the northwestern horizon as Japanese ships engaged Brooks's lone Avenger. Moments later, colored splashes began erupting around the carriers as Japanese ships opened fire with ranging shots. The Japanese used different colored dyes in their shells to allow spotters to identify which ship was scoring hits. Red, green, yellow, and blue splashes began walking toward the American carriers, creating what one officer described as a deadly rainbow advancing across the water. At 0646, Yamato fired her first salvo from maximum range, hurling 9 tons of steel and explosive toward the small American carriers. Sprague faced an impossible tactical situation with no good options. His carriers could not outrun Japanese ships that could sustain 30 knots. His 5-inch guns could not penetrate battleship armor. His aircraft carried ordnance meant for ground support missions, not armor-piercing weapons for naval combat. The nearest American heavy ships capable of challenging Kurita belonged to Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment group 90 miles south, having just finished annihilating the Japanese southern force at Surigao Strait. They could not reach Samar for hours. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was 300 miles north, pursuing Ozawa's carriers, needing 6 hours minimum to return even if recalled immediately. Sprague had perhaps 15 minutes before Japanese shells found their range and began systematically destroying his carriers. Yet, in those minutes, he formulated a response that would become legendary in naval warfare. First, he ordered all carriers to launch every available aircraft immediately. Pilots scrambled wearing pajamas or shorts, engines turning over before pre-flight checks were complete. Second, he turned his formation east-southeast toward a rain squall his radar operator had spotted, buying precious minutes of concealment. Third, he ordered maximum speed from his carriers, pushing boilers beyond design limits. Fourth, he commanded his escorts to generate smoke, creating dense artificial fog banks between the carriers and Japanese optical rangefinders. At 0650, Sprague transmitted an uncoded message on all frequencies. Under attack by Japanese cruiser force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers. Request immediate assistance. The clear text broadcast violated normal radio security, but was received by every American naval unit in the Philippines, triggering immediate panic in multiple headquarters. Admiral Kincaid realized with horror that no American heavy ships protected the northern approach. Admiral Halsey, 300 miles north engaging Ozawa, received Sprague's call with equal horror, but relief would take hours to arrive. Taffy 3 had only minutes. At 0701, the first Japanese salvos began landing among the carriers. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns fired shells weighing 3,220 pounds, projectiles heavier than a compact automobile. Heavy cruiser 8-inch guns fired 260-pound shells designed to gut unarmored targets like escort carriers. Against this onslaught, the carriers' thin steel hulls, a fraction of an inch thick in places, offered no protection whatsoever. Sprague's ships zigzagged frantically using a tactic called chasing splashes. Officers watched where shells landed and immediately steered toward those spots, gambling that Japanese gunners would not fire twice at the same location. This desperate improvisation actually worked more often than not. Shells that should have struck home instead screamed past bow or stern, missing by yards. The rain squall provided temporary reprieve at 0706. For 10 precious minutes, Taffy 3 steamed through torrential rain that reduced visibility to less than 1,000 yards. Japanese guns fell temporarily silent, unable to see their targets. Officers and crew used those minutes to organize damage control parties, prepare abandoned ship stations, and say prayers. Many believed they would not survive the next hour. As Taffy 3 emerged from the squall at 0716, the tactical situation had worsened dramatically. Kurita's force had closed range by several miles during the chase. Colored splashes now erupted around the carriers with frightening accuracy. Direct hits were inevitable. Sprague made the decision that would define the battle. At 0716, he ordered the destroyers to conduct a torpedo attack against the Japanese force. Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston had already made his decision 6 minutes earlier. At 0710, without waiting for orders, Evans had independently turned Johnston northward toward the enemy and begun his attack run. Evans was Cherokee and Creek Indian from Oklahoma, proud of his heritage and fearless to the point of recklessness. His features reflected his Native American ancestry, earning him the nickname Chief among his crew, though never to his face. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year before Samar, Evans had addressed his crew with words that became legendary. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single sailor requested transfer. Now Evans pointed his ship toward the heart of the Japanese formation and ordered flank speed. Johnston's turbines screamed as she accelerated past 35 knots, racing toward ships that outweighed her 50-1. The range when Johnston began her run was approximately 35,000 yards, over 17 nautical miles. Her Mark 15 torpedoes had effective range of 10,000 yards, just under 6 miles. To launch, Evans would have to penetrate through 17 miles of heavy gunfire. This decision requires understanding what became the defining tactical innovation of the Battle off Samar, the aggressive head-on charge by destroyers against vastly superior forces. The approach contradicted every assumption about how weaker forces should behave when confronted by overwhelming strength. Standard doctrine dictated that destroyers facing battleships should lay smoke and withdraw, preserving assets for future operations. Evans rejected this framework completely. He recognized that conventional defensive tactics guaranteed the carrier's destruction within the hour. The Japanese would simply steam through smoke screens, close range, and systematically sink every escort carrier. Withdrawal preserved destroyers but doomed carriers. The only possibility of saving the carriers required disrupting the Japanese attack immediately, forcing their ships to maneuver defensively, breaking up their formation, and buying time for American aircraft to strike. This required destroyers to attack with such ferocity that Japanese commanders believed they faced fleet destroyers screening fleet carriers, not escort destroyers protecting jeep carriers. The psychology was critical. Kurita had been briefed that American escort carriers operated with minimal screens in rear areas. Fleet carriers operated with multiple destroyer and cruiser escorts. If the Japanese could be convinced they faced the main American carrier force rather than escort carriers, they might proceed more cautiously, might maneuver defensively, might waste time repositioning for optimal attack. But creating that psychological effect required destroyers to behave in ways that seemed insane. They had to charge directly at battleships. They had to close to point-blank range. They had to maintain attack courses, even while absorbing hits from guns that could destroy them with single salvos. Most critically, they could not hesitate or show any indication of doubt. The attack had to be executed with complete commitment, as if the destroyers possessed advantages they manifestly lacked. Johnston's crew laid chemical smoke as she charged, generating thick artificial fog that partially obscured her from Japanese optical rangefinders. But smoke could not stop shells. At 0707, Johnston engaged Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano with her 5 5-inch guns at maximum range. The Mark 37 fire control director linked to a Mark 1A computer gave American destroyers devastating advantage in gunnery accuracy. While Japanese optical rangefinders struggled with smoke and rapidly changing ranges, Johnston's radar painted perfect firing solutions continuously updated in real time. Johnston's shells began hitting Kumano repeatedly. The destroyer's 54-pound projectiles could not penetrate the cruiser's armored belt, 4 to 5 inches of hardened steel protecting her vitals, but they could devastate her superstructure and upper works, where thinner armor created vulnerabilities. Over the next 10 minutes, Johnston fired over 200 main battery rounds at astonishing sustained rate, maintained through superbly trained gun crews working in perfect coordination. At least 45 shells struck the heavy cruiser, starting multiple fires and devastating her bridge and fire control stations. Kumano's topside became an inferno of exploding shells and burning metal. Her communications were severed. Her fire control was disrupted. At 0720, having closed to 10,300 yards, Evans launched Johnston's entire spread of 10 torpedoes. One torpedo, possibly two, slammed into Kumano's bow. The explosions tore off the entire forward section from bow to forward turret. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Kumano's speed dropped immediately to 8 knots as water flooded forward compartments. She turned away from battle, escorted by heavy cruiser Suzuya detailed to protect the crippled ship, removing 2 major Japanese units from the fight. Johnston had accomplished what seemed impossible. A 2,100-ton destroyer had crippled a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser armed with 10 8-inch guns, but victory came at terrible price. At 0730, as Johnston turned to hide in her own smoke, Yamato fired a full 9-gun salvo at what her fire control station had identified as an American light cruiser. 3 18.1-inch shells struck Johnston almost simultaneously. The first hit below the waterline aft, penetrating the destroyer's unarmored hull as easily as a rifle bullet through paper. The explosion tore into the after engine room, rupturing steam lines and flooding compartments. Scalding steam erupted as 600-degree pressurized vapor flashed seawater into more steam. Men in the engine room died instantly, either killed by the explosion or boiled alive. The second shell struck amidships, destroying Johnston's aft engine completely and severing power to the rear half of the ship. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17 instantly. The third shell hit 2/3 down the ship, severing electrical power to 3 of her 5 gun turrets, leaving only the 2 forward mounts operational. Yamato's secondary battery of 6.1-inch guns fired simultaneously. 3 shells slammed into Johnston's superstructure with devastating effect. One destroyed an anti-aircraft director and killed its crew. 2 more struck forward, obliterating the torpedo director and tearing apart the bridge. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. Commander Evans was blown off his feet, 2 fingers of his left hand severed by steel fragments, his uniform shirt literally torn off his body. Much of his bridge crew was killed instantly. Blood covered every surface on what remained of the bridge. With power lost to 3 gun turrets, steering control severed, engines crippled, and half his bridge crew dead or wounded, Johnston should have been finished. Standard doctrine dictated that a destroyer suffering such damage should retreat immediately or face certain destruction. But Evans was not a standard officer, and Johnston's crew was not a standard crew. Damage control parties worked with desperate efficiency, learned through endless training. Within 10 minutes, they restored electrical power to the 2 forward gun turrets through emergency cables. They re-established steering control to the emergency station on the fantail. Evans, despite severe wounds and significant blood loss, refused medical treatment beyond minimal field dressing. All medical supplies for wounded crew, he ordered. Save the medicine for men who need it more than I do. Evans relocated his command from the shattered bridge to the fantail, where manual steering was being conducted. He shouted, steering orders through an open hatch to sailors manually turning the rudder, cranking the heavy mechanism that normally operated through hydraulic power. Johnston was still in the fight, reduced to 17 knots with 3 of 5 guns out of action, half her crew dead or wounded, but she remained combat effective through sheer determination. At this critical moment, USS Hoel and USS Heermann began their own torpedo runs, followed by the 4 destroyer escorts. The converging attacks created chaos in the Japanese formation. Kurita's ships had been steaming in cruising formation optimized for speed and mutual support, not for maneuvering combat. Aggressive American attacks forced them to maneuver independently to avoid torpedoes, breaking up coordinated fire plans and creating confusion in command and control. Japanese commanders had expected to steamroll American carriers through overwhelming firepower. Instead, they found themselves dodging torpedoes, maneuvering to avoid collisions, and losing track of both enemy positions and their own ships' locations in smoke and rain. This was the second critical element of the head-on charge tactic, disruption through aggressive multi-axis attacks. USS Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, charged directly toward Japanese battleships in the center of their formation. At 0743, she launched half-salvo of 5 torpedoes at Battleship Congo from 9,000 yards. The battleship turned hard to starboard to avoid the spread, combing the torpedoes by presenting her narrow bow, but the maneuver forced Congo to cease firing temporarily and took her out of position. At 0754, Hoel fired her remaining 5 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Haguro from under 6,000 yards, terrifyingly close in naval terms. At least one torpedo struck Haguro in engineering spaces, causing flooding and forcing the cruiser to reduce speed. But Hoel paid terrible price. Japanese shells began hammering the destroyer. Over the next 45 minutes, Hoel absorbed over 40 major caliber hits from battleship and cruiser guns. Her bridge was destroyed by an 8-inch shell that killed most officers stationed there. Her forward engine room flooded from hits below the waterline. Her No. 2 gun mount was blown off its foundation. All steering control was lost. All power was lost when her remaining engine room flooded at 0830. With his ship dead in the water, listing heavily and sinking, Commander Kintberger ordered abandon ship. Hoel rolled over and sank stern first at 0855. Of her crew of 273, only 86 survived. USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, executed perhaps the most daring maneuver of the entire battle. At 0754, she launched her full spread of torpedoes at Battleship Haruna from 4,400 yards, less than 2.5 miles. The torpedoes missed as Haruna turned hard to avoid, but the battleship was forced to turn away from carriers, taking her temporarily out of effective gun range. Moments later, Heermann found herself trapped between 2 columns of Japanese heavy cruisers closing from different directions. With suicidal courage and remarkable ship-handling skill, Hathaway steered Heermann directly between Battleship Congo and heavy cruiser Chikuma, crossing both ships' bows at point-blank range. The Japanese ships, faced with an American destroyer suddenly appearing directly between them at ranges under 5,000 yards, were forced to turn hard to avoid collision, masking each other's gunfire and losing track of Heermann in confusion. The 4 destroyer escorts, designed for anti-submarine warfare and never intended for surface combat, followed the destroyers into battle. USS Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was the smallest of the small boys, displacing only 1,350 tons. Copeland pushed his ship beyond design limits to keep pace, overpressuring boilers to 660 pounds per square inch, well beyond design limit of 440. Before ordering his ship into battle, Copeland addressed his crew over the public address system with words that became legendary. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The words were matter of fact, not dramatic. Copeland simply stated the tactical reality every man aboard already understood. At 0810, Samuel B. Roberts launched her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Chokai from approximately 4,000 yards. One torpedo struck Chokai's stern engineering spaces, causing catastrophic damage. Combined with a 500-pound bomb hit from a Taffy 2 aircraft minutes later, Chokai was left dead in the water. Destroyer Fujinami later scuttled the crippled cruiser. Roberts had achieved what her designers never imagined possible. A destroyer escort had mission-killed a heavy cruiser. Roberts then engaged heavy cruiser Chikuma in an extended gun duel at ranges fluctuating between 5,000 and 7,000 yards. Her 2 5-inch guns fired 608 rounds in 35 minutes, sustained rate of over 17 rounds per minute per gun, astonishing for manually loaded weapons. The aft gun mount was commanded by Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, a 24-year-old from Checotah, Oklahoma. Carr's gun crew maintained incredible rate of fire even after losing electrical power, manually cranking the turret and hand-loading each 54-pound shell. At approximately 0850, a Japanese 8-inch shell struck the mount, penetrating and exploding inside. The blast killed or wounded most of the crew, but Carr, though horribly wounded, refused to abandon his post. At 0851, a powder charge cooked off in the overheated breech, detonating prematurely. The explosion destroyed the gun mount completely. Carr was caught directly in the blast, suffering catastrophic wounds. When rescue parties reached the mount after abandoned ship order, they found Carr dying at his station, still holding the mount's final shell, begging with his last breaths for someone to load it so the gun could keep firing. He died moments later. At 0851, an 8-inch shell from Chikuma penetrated Samuel B. Roberts below the waterline, exploding in the forward engine room. The explosion ruptured steam lines, ignited fuel oil, and flooded compartments simultaneously. The engine room became a death trap. Most personnel died within seconds. At 0909, a second shell struck near the aft 5-inch mount. At 0910, with his ship dead in the water and flooding uncontrollably, Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordered abandon ship. Samuel B. Roberts capsized and sank at approximately 10:05. Throughout these surface actions, American aircraft swarmed over Japanese ships in continuous attacks. Taffy 3's pilots faced impossible situations. Their aircraft carried ordnance meant for ground targets. Many Avengers had already expended torpedoes on pre-dawn strikes against Japanese positions ashore. Some pilots attacked with depth charges, cylindrical weapons designed to explode underwater near submarines, nearly worthless against surface ships but dropped anyway. When bombs and torpedoes were gone, pilots made dry runs, diving at Japanese ships without weapons, forcing enemy commanders to maneuver and spoiling their gunnery. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders proved profound. Vice Admiral Kurita, watching wave after wave of American aircraft attacking, became convinced he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The ferocity and persistence of air attacks seemed impossible from small jeep carriers. Pilots from Taffy 2 joined the battle as word spread. Rear Admiral Felix Stump, commanding Taffy 2, immediately ordered his squadrons rearmed with heavier weapons. Within 30 minutes, Taffy 2 launched strike after strike. Throughout the 90-minute surface battle, Taffy 2 launched 3 full strikes totaling over 70 sorties. These attacks proved devastating, sinking 3 Japanese heavy cruisers and damaging others. The escort carriers themselves became direct targets as Japanese ships closed range. USS Gambier Bay, positioned on the port flank, fell behind as her engines could not maintain pace. By 0800, Gambier Bay had become isolated. At 0807, Japanese heavy cruisers Chikuma, Tone, and Haguro concentrated fire from approximately 15,000 yards. Their 8-inch shells began finding range. At 0810, shells hit Gambier Bay's after-flight deck, starting fires. At 0820, a shell penetrated below the waterline near the forward engine room, causing catastrophic flooding. The forward engine room flooded completely. Gambier Bay lost use of one engine. Her speed dropped from 18 knots to 11. She fell further behind, now isolated and defenseless. Johnston, despite crippled condition, attempted to draw fire away from Gambier Bay. Commander Evans ordered his 2 remaining operational guns to engage the cruisers, hammering the carrier. Johnston's shells struck Chikuma and Tone, causing minor damage but forcing both cruisers to temporarily shift fire. But 3 cruisers firing from close range could not be deterred long. Multiple hits struck Gambier Bay's engine spaces, hangar deck, and hull. Fires raged through the riddled carrier. At 0840, Gambier Bay was dead in the water, listing heavily with fires visible throughout her structure. At 0850, Captain Walter Vueweg ordered abandon ship. At 0907, Gambier Bay capsized to port. At 0911, she sank, disappearing beneath the surface in less than a minute. From first hit to final sinking, only 61 minutes elapsed. She was the only American fleet or light carrier sunk by surface gunfire during World War II. The other carriers suffered heavy damage but remained afloat through desperate maneuvering and the sacrificial attacks of masters. Their escorts. USS Kalinin Bay was hit 15 times by shells ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch caliber. One 14-inch armor-piercing shell from Battleship Congo passed completely through the carrier without exploding. The delayed action fuse failed to trigger. Had it exploded, Kalinin Bay would have been destroyed instantly. At approximately 0845, crippled and surrounded by Japanese destroyers, USS Johnston made her final heroic charge. Commander Evans observed Japanese light cruiser Yahagi and destroyers forming up for coordinated torpedo attack on the carriers. Despite having only one operational gun turret, one barely functional engine producing perhaps 10 knots, and steering controlled by men manually cranking the rudder, Evans turned Johnston toward the 5 enemy ships. It was suicide, and every man aboard knew it, but the carriers had to be protected. Johnston's remaining forward gun fired as fast as the crew could load, scoring hits on Yahagi, but Japanese destroyers quickly surrounded Johnston, pounding her with gunfire from point-blank range. At 0910, with all guns silenced, both engines destroyed, fires raging throughout the ship, and hull listing heavily, Commander Evans ordered abandon ship. At 01010, USS Johnston rolled over and sank rapidly. As she went down, sailors on Japanese destroyer Yukikaze came on deck and stood at attention, saluting the sinking American destroyer in recognition of her crew's extraordinary courage. Commander Ernest Evans was seen abandoning ship but was never recovered. Of Johnston's crew of 327, only 141 survived. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in United States Navy history to receive the nation's highest decoration for valor. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of USS Johnston in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet." The first to lay smokescreen and open fire as enemy task force rapidly approached, Commander Evans gallantly diverted powerful blasts of hostile guns from lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection. At 0925, after nearly 2.5 hours of continuous combat, something miraculous occurred. The Japanese attack faltered. Vice Admiral Kurita, his command and control disrupted by aggressive American destroyer attacks, continuous airstrikes, and confusion about what forces he actually faced, ordered his scattered ships to reform and regroup. What Kurita did not realize was that he had been on the verge of complete victory. The American destroyers were sunk or sinking. The destroyer escorts were out of torpedoes, low on ammunition, and critically damaged. The carriers were nearly out of fuel and ammunition. Gambier Bay was sinking. The others were damaged and slowing. Another 30 minutes of sustained attack would have destroyed Taffy 3 completely and left Leyte Gulf's invasion beaches utterly defenseless. Instead, Kurita withdrew. The decision remains controversial among historians 8 decades later. From the American perspective, the withdrawal seemed impossible to believe. Aboard USS Fanshawe Bay, a signalman called out words that captured the surreal moment. "God damn it, boys. They're getting away." Officers and crew stared in disbelief as massive Japanese battleships and cruisers turned northward and began steaming away from carriers they had been on the verge of destroying. Sprague himself was incredulous. His after-action report reflected his amazement. The success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. The Battle off Samar stands apart in naval history for its sheer improbability. Never before or since has such mismatch in forces resulted in such outcome. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers against 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The tonnage ratio was approximately 10-1 favouring the Japanese. Yet the smaller force not only survived but forced the larger force to withdraw without accomplishing its mission. How did this seemingly impossible result occur? Tactical analysis reveals multiple contributing factors, each necessary but none sufficient alone. First, the aggressive American destroyer attacks disrupted Japanese formation integrity at critical moments. Kurita's ships had been steaming in formation optimized for fuel efficiency, not combat. Sudden need to maneuver independently to avoid American torpedoes scattered the formation. Ships maneuvered without coordination, each captain making independent decisions. Ships masked each other's line of fire. Communications broke down. Individual Japanese commanders lost track of both American positions and their own fleet dispositions. Second, smoke screens laid by American destroyers and destroyer escorts compounded confusion, reducing visibility dramatically and degrading Japanese optical fire control systems that depended on clear sight lines. Third, American radar-directed gunnery proved far superior to Japanese optical fire control in conditions that prevailed off Samar. The Mark 37 Fire Control Director gave American destroyers ability to generate accurate firing solutions continuously, despite smoke, rain, and rapidly changing ranges. Fourth, American damage control proved superior, keeping ships fighting longer despite critical damage. Johnston fought effectively for over 2 hours after losing half her propulsion. Fifth, Japanese armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate battleship armor over-penetrated thin hulls of American destroyers and escort carriers, reducing their destructive effect. The delayed action fuses triggered detonation after penetrating several inches of steel. Against destroyer hulls a fraction of an inch thick, shells often passed completely through before detonating. But the fundamental factor was human courage and tactical audacity executed with such ferocity that it convinced the enemy they faced much more powerful force. Commander Ernest Evans charged toward Yamato without orders because he understood instinctively that aggressive action was the only chance for survival. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland took Samuel B. Roberts into battle, knowing survival was impossible, but attack was necessary. These decisions were not made from positions of strength, they were made from desperation. But they were executed with such complete commitment and ferocity that they convinced Vice Admiral Kurita he faced fleet carriers and heavy units rather than escort carriers and destroyers. The Japanese had been trained in Mahanian naval doctrine, emphasizing decisive fleet actions between battleships. They expected opponents to maneuver cautiously, preserving strength for climactic engagement. Weaker forces were supposed to retreat when confronted by superior strength, not attack suicidally. American destroyers violated every assumption about how weaker force should behave. They attacked with complete aggression. They closed to point-blank range. They fought until their ships literally sank beneath them. This behavior was incomprehensible within the Japanese tactical framework. It caused confusion and uncertainty that contributed materially to Kurita's belief that he faced much larger force than actually opposed him. The aftermath of the battle produced immediate recognition of extraordinary valor displayed by Taffy 3. The entire task unit was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit decorations the United States can bestow. The citation praised the extraordinary heroism in action against powerful units of the Japanese fleet, and noted specifically that 2 of the unit's valiant destroyers and 1 destroyer escort charged the battleships point-blank, and, expending their last torpedoes in desperate defense of the entire group, went down under the enemy's heavy shells as climax to 2.5 hours of sustained and furious combat. But there was no time for relief or celebration. At 10:50, even as Taffy 3 recovered from the surface action and rescued survivors, a new threat appeared. 5 Japanese aircraft approached at low altitude from the west, climbed to approximately 2,500 feet, then dove directly toward the carriers. These were not conventional attacks. The pilots had no intention of pulling out of their dives. They were aiming their entire aircraft at American ships. The Divine Wind, the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps, was making its first organized appearance of the war. 1 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter crashed into USS Kitkun Bay's port side near the waterline. Its bomb exploded on impact, blowing a hole in the carrier's hull and causing flooding, but damage was not fatal. Another kamikaze targeted USS White Plains, but was destroyed by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft exploded in mid-air and crashed into the sea, showering the carrier with debris but causing no significant damage. USS Street Low was not as fortunate. At 10:53, a Zero fighter piloted by Lieutenant Yukio Seki dove through heavy anti-aircraft fire and crashed through Street Low's wooden flight deck near the centerline. The aircraft's 250-kilogram bomb detonated inside the hangar deck, igniting aviation gasoline and armed ordnance waiting to be loaded on aircraft. Secondary explosions tore through the ship as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in intense heat. Within minutes, flames consumed Street Low, from stem to stern. Fires spread faster than damage control parties could contain them. At 11:25, with fires raging out of control and major explosions occurring every few minutes, Captain Francis McKenna ordered abandon ship. Street Low exploded in a massive fireball at 11:25 and sank within minutes, the first major American warship sunk by kamikaze attack. Taffy 3 had survived both the surface attack and the kamikaze strike, but the cost was staggering. 5 ships sunk in combat: USS Johnston, USS Howell, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Gambier Bay, and USS Street Low. Multiple other ships damaged, some severely. American casualties totaled 1,161 killed and missing, plus 913 wounded. The survivors who abandoned ship spent up to 50 hours floating in tropical waters before rescue ships found them. Many men died from wounds, exposure, dehydration, or shark attack while awaiting rescue. The waters off Samar were heavily populated with sharks attracted by warm water and abundant food sources. Survivors reported seeing sharks constantly during their time in the water. Some men simply disappeared, pulled under by predators. Others died from wounds that would have been survivable with immediate medical care but proved fatal after hours in the water. But Taffy 3 had accomplished its mission completely. The invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf remained secure. General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 troops continued landing unopposed by naval gunfire. The Japanese center force, despite its overwhelming superiority in firepower, had been turned back without reaching its objective. The story of the Battle off Samar represents more than tactical innovation or individual heroism. It reveals a profound truth about naval warfare that contradicts conventional analysis based purely on tonnage, gun caliber, and armor thickness. The mathematics suggested certain defeat. 4 battleships against 6 escort carriers should produce only one outcome. The destroyers charging those battleships should have been annihilated without accomplishing anything meaningful. Yet the outcome defied the mathematics, because the calculations failed to account for human factors that cannot be quantified in tactical analysis. The aggressive head-on charges by American destroyers worked not because they possessed hidden advantages or superior technology. They worked because they created psychological effects that influenced enemy decision-making at critical moments. When Commander Ernest Evans turned Johnston toward Yamato and charged at flank speed, he was not executing a maneuver with high probability of success. He was gambling that aggressive action might create enough confusion and disruption to buy minutes for the carriers. When Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland took Samuel B. Roberts into battle against heavy cruisers, he understood his ship would likely be sunk. The goal was not survival. The goal was inflicting enough damage and creating enough chaos to delay the Japanese advance. These decisions represented calculated desperation. The destroyer captains understood conventional defensive tactics guaranteed failure. Laying smoke and withdrawing preserved destroyers but allowed Japanese ships to close range unmolested and systematically destroy carriers. The carriers could not be saved through cautious tactics. They could only be saved if the Japanese attack could be disrupted so thoroughly that their commanders lost confidence in their intelligence about what forces they faced. This required creating the impression of strength where none existed. It required destroyers to behave as if they possessed advantages they manifestly lacked. It required maintaining attack courses even while absorbing hits from guns that could destroy them with single salvos. Most critically, it required absolute commitment without hesitation or doubt visible in maneuvers. The Japanese commanders, watching American destroyers charge their battleships, had to make sense of behavior that seemed irrational. Destroyers did not charge battleships unless they had support. Escort destroyers, screening escort carriers, did not attack with such ferocity. The aggressive attacks, combined with continuous air strikes from what seemed like an inexhaustible source, suggested the Americans possessed more strength than Japanese intelligence had indicated. Vice Admiral Kurita had been briefed that Taffy 3 consisted of escort carriers with minimal screens operating in rear areas providing close air support. The reality he encountered seemed incompatible with that briefing. The carriers were launching strike after strike. The destroyers were attacking with determination that suggested fleet units. The coordination between surface units and aircraft suggested sophisticated command and control. Kurita's own experience over the previous 72 hours reinforced his uncertainty. On October 23, American submarines had torpedoed his flagship, nearly killing him. He had spent hours swimming in shark-infested waters while his command exploded around him. On October 24, American carrier aircraft had attacked his force throughout the afternoon, sinking Musashi and damaging multiple other ships. Now, on October 25, he faced what appeared to be another major American force, with carriers and aggressive destroyer screens. The psychological impact of 3 days of continuous combat, combined with the disruption caused by American destroyer attacks and the confusion created by smoke screens and maneuvering, created conditions where Kurita's judgment became clouded by uncertainty. He believed he faced the main American carrier force. He feared American battleships might be nearby, ready to trap his force. He worried about fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure if the engagement continued. At 9:25, when Kurita ordered withdrawal to regroup and assess the situation, he was making what seemed like a reasonable decision based on incomplete information and significant uncertainty. He did not realize how close he had been to complete victory. He did not understand that the carriers were nearly defenseless, that the destroyer attacks had been acts of desperation rather than coordinated tactics supported by superior forces. The withdrawal represented strategic failure born from tactical confusion. The head-on charges by American destroyers had created enough chaos and uncertainty to convince an enemy commander facing certain victory to abandon his attack at the moment of triumph. This outcome reveals something fundamental about naval combat that transcends specific weapons systems or tactical manuals. Warfare between humans involves psychological dimensions that cannot be reduced to mathematical calculations. An opponent's perception of your strength matters as much as your actual strength. Creating uncertainty in enemy decision-making can be more valuable than inflicting material damage. The destroyer captains at Samar understood this instinctively. They could not sink battleships with 5-inch guns. They could not outrun heavy cruisers. They could not survive sustained combat against forces that outweighed them 50-1. But they could create chaos. They could disrupt formations. They could force enemy ships to maneuver defensively. They could buy time. And most importantly, they could create the impression that American forces were stronger and more dangerous than Japanese intelligence had indicated. The tactic succeeded because it was executed with such complete commitment. There was no hesitation, no indication of doubt, no retreat when shells began landing. The destroyers charged directly at battleships and maintained attack courses, even while absorbing catastrophic damage. This behavior could not be reconciled with the Japanese understanding of how weak forces behave when confronted by overwhelming strength. The aftermath of the battle fundamentally changed how naval officers understood the relationship between firepower and resolve. The standard calculations that balanced gun caliber, armor thickness, and tonnage had to be revised to account for intangible factors like crew training, damage, control effectiveness, tactical audacity, and psychological impact on enemy decision-making. In the months following Samar, American naval doctrine incorporated lessons about aggressive action by screening forces against superior enemies. The principle that emerged emphasized that defensive tactics by weaker forces often guaranteed defeat, while aggressive tactics created possibilities for disruption and confusion that might influence outcomes beyond what pure firepower calculations suggested. This did not mean suicide attacks became standard doctrine. The destroyer charges at Samar succeeded partly because of specific circumstances that created opportunities for psychological effect. Japanese command and control had been disrupted by 3 days of combat. Kurita personally had nearly died and was operating under extreme stress. Communications between Japanese ships had broken down. Smoke and weather reduced visibility, but the broader lesson was that weaker forces, facing certain defeat through defensive tactics, might achieve better outcomes through aggressive action that created chaos and uncertainty. This principle would influence American naval tactics for decades, particularly in thinking about how screening forces should respond when main battle forces were not available for support. The human cost of these tactics remained devastating. USS Johnston lost 186 men from crew of 327. USS Howell lost 187 from crew of 273. USS Samuel B. Roberts lost 89 killed in action with additional 25, dying from wounds or exposure, from crew of 224. USS Gambier Bay lost 147 immediately with more succumbing afterward, from crew of approximately 800. The survivors faced horror in the water that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Men clung to wreckage and life rafts for up to 50 hours before rescue ships arrived. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly. Dehydration became critical. Wounds attracted sharks. Men watched shipmates weaken and slip beneath the surface. Some survivors developed psychological trauma that manifested decades later as survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress. But survival rates were higher than might be expected given the violence of the ship's sinkings. This reflected excellent training in abandoned ship procedures and adequate life-saving equipment. American ships carried sufficient life rafts and individual flotation devices. Crews were trained in survival procedures and practiced them regularly. When orders came to abandon ship, men executed those orders efficiently even in chaos of battle damage, fires, and flooding. The wreckage of the sunken ships remained lost for decades. The Philippine Trench, where the battle occurred, features some of the deepest water in any ocean, with depths exceeding 20,000 feet in areas where Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay went down. Until very recently, technology did not exist to explore such depths. In March 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo located the wreck of USS Johnston at depth of 21,180 feet using the deep submersible limiting factor. The wreck rests on an undersea slope, broken into sections but largely intact. Her bridge shows damage from the 6.1-inch shells that killed Commander Evans and much of his crew. Her stern section displays catastrophic damage from Yamato's 18.1-inch shells. In June 2022, Vescovo's team located USS Samuel B. Roberts at 22,621 feet, making her the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The destroyer Escort lies broken into two sections. The forward section rests upright on the seabed. The aft section lies on its side about 10 meters away. The break occurred at the point where the 8-inch shell penetrated her engine room, the hit that ultimately sank her. Both wreck sites are protected under the Sunken Military Craft Act, designating them as war graves that cannot be disturbed. The remote locations and extreme depths provide natural protection. The ships will rest undisturbed as memorials to their crews. The legacy of the Battle off Samar extends beyond individual acts of heroism or tactical innovations. The battle revealed that naval combat cannot be reduced to simple calculations, comparing tonnage, gun caliber, and armor thickness. Human factors, psychological effects, tactical audacity, and the willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives all influence outcomes in ways that defy quantitative analysis. The destroyer captains who charged battleships head-on at Samar did not have superior weapons or hidden advantages. They had training, determination, and the understanding that conventional defensive tactics guaranteed defeat. They chose aggressive action, knowing it would likely result in their deaths, but believing it offered the only possibility of saving the carriers they were sworn to protect. This choice, repeated by multiple commanding officers independently arriving at the same conclusion, created cumulative effects that disrupted the Japanese attack so thoroughly that an enemy commander on the verge of complete victory withdrew without accomplishing his objective. The mathematics said it was impossible. The human factors made it reality. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz's assessment remains definitive. The success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, official historian of U.S. naval operations in World War II, provided the most enduring tribute. In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 0700 and 0930 off Samar. The Battle of Leyte Gulf as a whole was the largest naval battle in history measured by tonnage of ships engaged, geography covered, and strategic consequences. Over 200,000 personnel participated across an action area of approximately 100,000 square miles of ocean. The Japanese Navy lost 26 warships totaling 306,000 tons displacement. 3 battleships were sunk, 4 carriers were sunk, 10 cruisers were sunk, 9 destroyers were sunk. Over 10,500 Japanese sailors died in the 4-day battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sortie as a major fleet. Fuel shortages, damage to surviving ships, and loss of trained personnel reduced the Navy to a defensive force incapable of strategic offensive operations. The Americans lost 6 ships totaling 37,000 tons. American casualties totaled 2,883 killed and 913 wounded across all engagements. The strategic victory was complete and decisive, but within that larger strategic picture, the battle off Samar stands as the most improbable action. The tonnage ratio was 10-1 favoring the Japanese. The gunpowder ratio was even more lopsided. Yet the outcome contradicted every prediction based on material factors. The smaller force not only survived, but forced the larger force to withdraw. This result cannot be explained through analysis of weapons systems, ship designs, or tactical manuals. It can only be understood through recognition that warfare involves human beings making decisions under extreme stress, with incomplete information. The destroyer captains who charged battleships created psychological effects that influenced enemy decision-making at critical moments. They did not sink the Japanese fleet. They convinced the Japanese fleet commander that continuing the attack involved risks he was unwilling to accept. That psychological victory, achieved through tactical audacity executed with absolute commitment, saved 6 escort carriers, protected American invasion forces at Leyte Gulf, and contributed materially to strategic victory in the Philippines campaign. The cost was devastating. 5 ships sunk, over 1,000 Americans killed. But the alternative, had the destroyers not attacked, would have been complete annihilation of Taffy 3 followed by Japanese battleship bombardment of American troops on the beaches. The destroyer captains made their choice knowing the likely outcome. They charged battleships because defensive tactics guaranteed failure, because their duty required protecting the carriers regardless of cost, and because aggressive action offered the only possibility, however remote, of disrupting the Japanese attack long enough for help to arrive or for enemy commanders to lose confidence. That choice, made independently by multiple officers who reached the same conclusion through their own analysis of the tactical situation, represents the finest tradition of naval service. It demonstrates that courage is not absence of fear, but willingness to act despite fear when duty requires action. It shows that leadership means making decisions that may cost your life and the lives of your crew when those decisions offer the only path toward accomplishing the mission. The legacy of that choice lives in naval doctrine that recognizes aggressive action by weaker forces can achieve outcomes beyond what material calculations predict. It lives in the understanding that human factors, psychological effects, and tactical audacity matter as much as gun caliber and armor thickness. It lives in the recognition that sometimes the impossible can be achieved through determination and sacrifice. On the morning of October 25, 1944, destroyer captains began charging head-on at battleships, not because they had discovered some tactical advantage or possessed superior weapons, but because they understood that conventional defensive tactics guaranteed the destruction of the carriers they were sworn to protect. They chose aggressive action knowing it would likely result in their deaths, believing it offered the only possibility of saving the ships and men depending on them. That choice, executed with absolute commitment despite catastrophic damage and overwhelming enemy firepower, created enough chaos and uncertainty to convince a Japanese commander on the verge of complete victory to withdraw without accomplishing his objective. The mathematical calculations said it was impossible. The human determination made it reality, and in doing so, those destroyer captains demonstrated that courage, training, and tactical audacity can sometimes overcome material disadvantages that appear insurmountable on paper. The small boys of Taffy 3 charged into harm's way, knowing they would not return. They did it anyway, because their duty required it, because the carriers had to be protected, and because American sailors at Leyte Gulf deserved commanders willing to sacrifice everything to keep them safe. In those 90 minutes off Samar, destroyer captains wrote a chapter in naval history that stands as testament to what can be achieved when ordinary men in desperate circumstances refuse to accept defeat, even when defeat seems absolutely certain. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.